Well, when I think about the connection between preaching and the work of justice in the world, the first thing that comes to mind is that the work of justice in the world is God's work. So if you're going to do the work of justice, you're doing the work of God. So you need to really understand deeply that God. You need to understand deeply that God and His relationship to the work of justice. And if you're going to do it in the world, you need to understand deeply that world. And so there seems to be deep and important teaching and revelation from God that He wants us to know if we're going to be working with Him in His work of justice in His world. It wouldn't make much sense to go off and do a job without checking in and being deeply familiar with the person whose job it is and whose work site it is, in a sense. It's very important that preachers empower the followers of Christ with deep, meaningful information, truth about this God of justice and about this world of injustice and what the implications are for the followers of this God in that work of justice in the world. When I think about preaching and the work of justice in the world, I think of this phrase from the Apostle Peter about preparing your mind for action. Right? Because the work of justice in the world is an active work. It's really a response of obedience to Christ, who says that we are supposed to follow Him in loving our neighbors. And so the work of justice is simply loving those who are victims of injustice and violent abuse and oppression, doing unto them what we would want done to us if we were victims. But that's a very active work in the world. But if we're going to do that work, our minds have to actually be prepared to do that. And so God has given us some very important truth that He wants us to know about Him, about the world, about the work of justice that prepares us for that kind of action. And one of the most important, I think, truths of Scripture that we have to understand and be prepared with is the notion that this is a fallen world of very, very deep injustice. Because many times what we fail to do is actually tell the truth about the nature of the world. Because we tend to create our own version of the world, kind of a subset reality. And we make that world sort of smaller and safer and more doable because we're pain averse, we're trying to get our lives under control. So the world that we put together tends to be smaller and safer and less demanding or difficult than it really is. So then when Jesus calls us into the world as it really is, our mind isn't prepared for action. Whereas what the Bible teaches us is that the world is a fallen place and it's not being managed well. And so if I understand that, I don't have the sensation of learning about the injustice and brutality that's real in our world and having a sense that I've walked into the wrong room somehow, or, well, wait a minute, Jesus says we're supposed to, go into the world and be loving and kind and so forth, and there's all this darkness and injustice. That doesn't come to us as a surprise because our mind is prepared for action with a true understanding of the nature of the world. Then it's also equally important then to then be prepared for action on the basis of an understanding of the nature of God. Because once we find out what the world is really like, then for many of us that's paralyzing, that makes us feel overwhelmed, and so then we go from obliviousness to the paralysis of despair. What puts us back into a position of responsible action? Well, it's preparing our minds for action with an understanding of the nature of God. Who's God? Who is God in relation to this evil in the world, in relation to injustice? What does He promise? What does He promise to provide to His people as they do the work of justice? What does He not promise? What can we bank upon? What can we know about God no matter what we face in the struggle against injustice? When we're equipped with these kinds of things, we're actually prepared in our minds for the work of justice.